Welcome back to the Catholic History Minute. Today we're going to talk about the Spanish Inquisition. And the Spanish Inquisition is a massive topic, seeing as it spanned near 4 centuries. But this video is going to mainly focus on the Spanish Inquisition's investigation into those we call the Conversos. We'll tackle the Protestant side next time. Now, when most people refer to the Inquisition in common speech, they're actually referring to the Spanish Inquisition. And it's essential to distinguish the difference between the Spanish Inquisition and, say, the Papal Inquisition of Lucius III from 1184. Now, many of you aren't going to believe this, but the Inquisition still exists today in the Church. In fact, it's housed in many of the same buildings at the Vatican that the Inquisitors worked in during the Counter-Reformation. Now, it's gone by a couple of names over the centuries, for instance, the Holy Office, or the one that it goes by today, the Congregation on the Doctrine of the Faith. And while the temporal results have changed, i.e. no one is executed, the job of discovering and labeling those preaching heresy in the Church still is an important ministry. Okay, so then what happened to the Spanish Inquisition? Well, the Spanish Inquisition was a secular inquisition, meaning the secular government had a great deal more control than, say, the Inquisition that St. Dominic was a part of. Now, the advent of secular inquisitions is an interesting discussion, but for this, we're just going to note that most European nations at one point or another during the 14th and 15th centuries had them, and they were widely used by the Protestants when secular control fell to them. Somehow, though, that gets lost in the history books. Also, speaking specifically about the Spanish Inquisition, no one ever talks about the papacy's role in trying to limit and rein in the Spanish inquisitors. Anyway, there was great tragedy caused in Spain by this secular inquisition, and according to Professor Thomas Madden of St. Louis University, around 5,000 were executed for heresy over the several centuries of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, statistically speaking, this doesn't even begin to compare to the number of Catholics who were butchered in England, Wales, and Ireland by the Protestants. However, there's an even more disturbing part of this narrative. The clear majority of the 5,000 executed in Spain were devout Catholics, namely a group called the Conversos. You see, the Spanish Inquisition is a sad example of Catholics being condemned by churchmen and executed by a Catholic state. How could this happen? Well, it all started when Christendom forgot to say the Rosary. Now, you probably think I'm joking, but St. Louis Marie de Montfort has posited this theory, and I personally think it holds water. After the end of the 1200s, leading into the 1300s, we can see the rise of the nation-states. And as secular authorities gained power, Marian devotion for some reason or another began to fall away. And along with this lapse came the greatest disaster since the fall of Rome, the plague. St. Louis points to the Marian mystics who claimed that Our Lady would have prevented the devastating effects of the Black Death had Christendom only asked her. But of course, they didn't, and hell on earth became a reality. Well, most of the nations found an easy target for the plague, the Jews. Jewish persecution was not all that uncommon during the Middle Ages, especially by the French and English. Of course, the magisterium had on numerous occasions condemned Jewish persecution and the nations that took part in it. But by this time, the power of the Pope was waning in Christendom. Now, there were 2 main centers where Jews could go during the Middle Ages to seek refuge from persecution. First were the Papal States, and second was Spain. By the 14th century, Spain had a very large Jewish population, but when the Black Death showed up, even the more open-minded Spanish populace was driven to hysteria, and a Jewish persecution erupted in Spain. The mob would come together, and they'd collect all the Jews and give them an option: baptism or death. The majority of the Jews chose baptism. Now, of course, canon law states that baptism under duress is only valid after the duress has passed, the person wishes to remain in the church. Well, it took the magisterium and the secular government a while to stop these forced baptisms. However, after a couple of years, the pandemonium comes to an end, and the church starts to go through all these former Jews to try and figure out if they wish to accept the teachings of Christ without the punishment of death hanging over them. But here's where one of the great mysteries of history presents itself. Incredibly, most of these forced converts wish to remain Catholic. Historians are still debating what caused this phenomena because, the efficacious sacraments had nothing to do with it. In any event, most of these former Jews remained in the church and they took their new faith very seriously. They're what we know as the Conversos. However, they still had many of these cultural aspects of the Jews, which separated them from the rest of society. Well, several generations pass, and these Conversos become a part of Spanish society, specifically in the government. And they commit the greatest sin a new group can. They become very successful. The Jews who went back to Judaism, they see these Conversos as traitors. And the old Christians, well, they see them as infiltrators. There's a grand conspiracy in the minds of some Spanish Christians that these Conversos are just feigning piety in order to bring down the church and the Christian governments of Europe. It's important to note that the papacy spoke out loudly against this and demanded to see any evidence of these supposed crimes. Well, the Spanish Inquisition couldn't really present any, and that's because they weren't following the prescribed form of an Inquisition. The procedure of an Inquisition was based on Roman law, which meant you had to have evidence that the accused was in fact a heretic. Well, the Spanish Inquisitors weren't so concerned about that. Why? Because if an Inquisition found the accused to be in fact a heretic, their property was forfeit to the state. And the Conversos had a lot of property. You see, this part of the Spanish Inquisition, where the majority of the 5,000 died, was nothing more than a land grab by bad churchmen and government officials. And their victims were devout Catholics with an incredible faith. It led King Ferdinand to finally expel the Jews from Spain, which he actually didn't want to do, as well as numerous other tragedies in Spain. By 1517 and the coming of Luther, most of the Conversos are gone. So next time we're going to take a look at the Protestants versus the Spanish Inquisition, but before we end, it's important to note that the Spanish Inquisition was not the standard of Inquisitions, but the heinous exception to it. Men took an institution that had and still has great value for the faithful and used it for their own purposes. So today, thanks for watching, and we ask for St. Dominic's intercession.